And we'll just jump in. So really, this is going to be more about enterprise architecture than the map itself. I just included the map icon on here because it is the brand that some people know me by in the CTA, and that's what's attracting some people to the to these meetings. But I am, hang on, let me just get a reasonable view here. Yeah, but really, I'm going to talk about this through the lens of enterprise architecture. And there's a bunch of folks out there that are familiar with Charles Eisenstein's work, A More Beautiful World, Our Hearts Knew As Possible. There's overlap with folks that are aware of the Game B community. Many people have probably heard Daniel Schmachtenberger's treatise on the third attractor. This really is in kind of response to all of those and maybe the CTA itself. I'll go into that a little bit more as we get into it. So the question I'm sort of posing here is, can enterprise architecture be of service to those kinds of initiatives? And so I'm bringing it in because I happen to have background in enterprise architecture. As I said in the last talk, I don't know that, I don't believe that technology is the answer to what ails us. I think it's a cultural shift, and I think there are many other people that are doing, that are bringing their gifts that are more important than the gifts I can bring. But what I can do is operate from where I happen to have background and some skill. And so I was faced with this question of, what the role of enterprise architecture could be. And as I've been in the CTA, I've realized that there's actually a lot of parallels in what I experienced in my work in large corporations over the last 30 years to what I'm seeing architecturally emerging in the internet. And so the question is it possible to shift the perspective of enterprise architecture, because it's been pretty much focused on large organizations? Can we leverage some of the lessons learned to help us foster collaboration at global scale? So the other words you can read. I'm going to start with a case study. So this was work that I was involved in the early 1990s with a company called US West, which was the phone company for 14 states. So about a third of the United States geographically, certainly not population-wise, Western states. A company called US West. And in 1992, this is a slide. Well, it's a scan of a transparency, because back in those days, we still had these things called transparencies and overhead projectors. But it's a scan of an actual presentation I delivered in 1992. And it was part of a strategy effort at US West that came to be known as the vertical to horizontal transformation. And so what happened was we did an inventory of US West and their information systems environment, and discovered they had 1,000 applications they used to run their business. And these are pretty large applications, big IBM mainframe type applications, as you can imagine, running service activation for millions of customers, or billing, or ordering, or customer support, or network provisioning, what have you. Very large systems. They had data managers for more than 20 different vendors. They had more than 20 different operating systems, one of which was Unix, and we found 70 different versions of Unix running in our data centers. We had computers from more than 40 different vendors. And so we had this, what we called rampant technological heterogeneity. We also had customer data in more than 200 of these 1,000 systems. And of course, what each system defined as a customer wasn't the same. So to your point, Marc-Antoine, not everybody has the same idea. Not every ontology has the same concept. So keeping all that data consistent was a horrific issue. When US West, which had spun off from AT&T and originally a regulated entity, when they tried to compete in the marketplace, they and tried to become more customer centric. They literally had customer service reps who were on swivel chairs, because if the customer asked a billing question, they'd have to pivot their chair to the IBM 3270 terminal because that's what talked to that silo. And if they wanted to, if they had a question about the status of their repair order, they would pivot their chair to their VT100 terminal that talked to the DEX system behind that, and or their X terminal and so forth. They're liberty, pivoting their chair. So it was really high cost, really expensive to do all the integrations, to manage all the technology. Now, it might seem stupid that they built these silos, but these are actually a natural product of an era of what we called function automation, where you would automate some function that was really high volume or error prone, repetitive, and you get huge savings from that. So it was so successful, you'd do it again, and then you'd do it again and again. So it was only after years of automating functions that you find yourself in this position with all these silos. So I'm going to skip ahead to basically the target environment. The icons across the top of the slide show some intermediate steps, but I'm just going to jump to the final step where we said, okay, instead of the vertical silos, our target architecture is going to be structured horizontally. So we're going to have shared servers. We're going to have subject-oriented instead of application-oriented databases. So instead of customer data in 200 databases, what if we just had one customer database? Instead of these monolithic vertical applications, we're going to have small modular shared transactions that encoded business logic. Of course, we'd leverage our public communications network, being the phone company. And then our presentation environments were going to be user-centric. So we would, instead of asking what's the fastest, cheapest way of providing access to this application, which is kind of an inside-out perspective, looking from the application up to the user, we turned it around and said, what are the full range of tasks that this user needs to do? And let's optimize a presentation experience, a user experience that optimizes their ability to do their job. So no more swivel chairs, no more disparate look and feels across the different systems. Create a unified look and feel focused on that allowed them to do their job and be able to present the information in multiple presentation environments. Could be handheld portables, or we're just starting to get into mobile devices then. There could be direct customer access through voice response units. That's another kind of presentation environment. And then to make all this work, we envisioned standard interfaces, because you'll notice here there's this many-to-many relationship between all these layers. And so if you just do all these interfaces in a pairwise fashion, you sort of drown in a sea of interfaces and this integration nest. And so we thought, well, maybe we should introduce standard interfaces. So on the operating system front, we said, well, let's focus on the POSIX standard, and we'll try and write things that are compliant with POSIX. Then we can map it to, there's a IBM MBS implementation of POSIX and Unix implementation of POSIX and so forth. And then we'd have standard data services, probably SQL, standard application services, and that evolved through a variety of different standards as the standards and protocols for how you do remote invocation of services have evolved. Network services, we naively thought that we could move the world from TCP/IP to OSI. That didn't exactly happen. And then standard management interfaces that would allow this information environment to be operated in a fairly coherent way. So we had integrated management. So that was kind of the strategy. And so that was an example of a case study, right? So I'm going to now dive in just a little bit into enterprise architecture, since that's what the talk's about. I'm going to keep this fairly minimal, but mostly what I'm going to talk about is the evolution of enterprise architecture. And so in 2006, there was this great book written by folks at Harvard where they said the enterprise architecture, if you look at, you can see actual stages of maturity. You can see stages that different, that companies as a whole tend to go through. And what they identified as stage one was business silos. Well, of course, we saw that just in the US West example. And what many companies did among their first enterprise architecture moves, if you will, was to try and standardize technology. So we would Simon joined. Great. Welcome, Simon. Glad you found it. I know there was some confusion with the calendar invite. Yeah, so standardized technology. That really spoke to that heterogeneity that I talked about. And so instead of, and notice how there's a reframing of the question. So instead of saying, what's the hot technology at the time, when I'm building this application, I'm taking an application-specific view of it. We picked the technology that was cool at the time. This said, no, let's look across the organization and let's think carefully about how we manage our technology portfolio. So we began to create, approved products lists, and we would create roadmaps for this technology is deprecated, and we're going to invest in this, and we're no longer going to invest in that, and retire technology and so forth. And that was the folks that wrote this book observed that was a fairly common thing for large enterprises to do. And from there, and that reduced cost and operational complexity, but from there, the next stage was to move into application and data consolidation. So those 200 databases that we talked about, could we get that down to, subject-oriented databases? And this proliferation of applications, could we consolidate that to a smaller number so we're not dealing with 1,000 applications? And again, that was observed as a general stage that companies went through. And from there, they went into what was called business modularity. The problem with stage three is it reduced cost and complexity to a degree, but at the cost of agility, at the cost of being able to have competitive advantage, because if everybody could buy the same large application suite, then how could I, use that as a source of competitive advantage? And that led to a stage of what was called business modularity. Now, when they wrote this book in 2006, there weren't a lot of examples of business modularity at the time, but that did emerge. And then since then, we've seen the emergence of what I call stage 5. It's in blue only because it goes beyond what they talked about, because it emerged after 2006. So those were stages. The business modularity sort of broke up these monoliths into smaller composable units, and you could orchestrate through business process management. For example, you could orchestrate them in different ways. So you could take the same building blocks that others were using, but you could create streamlined business processes by composing them together in different ways. And then, of course, in the cloud, things move to the cloud. And so those were stages that individual companies tended to go through as they advanced their enterprise architecture maturity. But you can also see that the evolution of the IT industry as a whole tend to echo those stages. So, if I overlay some timescales, and they're not exact, but roughly we see a consolidation in the operating system space, to where there used to be a proliferation of OSs, pretty much Windows, Linux, Mac OS, emerged as sort of standard technologies. In the application and data consolidation, this is where Larry Ellison earned his first $1 billion, was the Oracle Relational Database Management System, which was a technology that supported these large shared databases. And then His next billion was with large application suites. So Oracle eBusiness and SAP are both examples of very large application suites on very large databases that helped support this application and data consolidation. And from there, they began to recognize the need for modularity. And so Oracle introduced Fusion and SAP introduced NetWeaver, which were business process management orchestration engines. And they, in fact, redid their entire application suite to build them around those technologies. Salesforce emerged in the cloud as a major competitor. Oracle moved their Fusion to the cloud, but the 800-pound gorilla in stage 5 is Amazon Web Services. Probably the people on this call know, but many don't, that because Amazon is known, of course, for their e-commerce dominance, but their whole e-commerce part of their business only is about 25% of their revenue. 75% of their revenue comes from AWS. And so this is true microservices implementation. So that's kind of the evolution of that individual companies went through and that the IT industry as a whole came through. But even the definition of what do we mean by enterprise evolved along the same line. So when you were focused on standardizing your technology, then sort of your operating definition of what an enterprise was, well, it's our organization, and it's really only large organizations that suffered from this technological heterogeneity. So large organizations and its technology assets. And then that evolved to our enterprise is our technology plus our data plus our apps. And then our enterprise, when you get into the business modularity, you have to start thinking about your extended enterprise. So who are our customers? Who are our suppliers? Because sometimes we, there's certainly players in our business processes and we directly integrate with their applications and data. And so the definition of enterprise extended to large enterprise and pretty much stayed that when it moved into stage 5. The definition of enterprise didn't change too much there. So that's kind of the evolution of the definition of the enterprise. I'm going to show one more example. Let me speak to this, I guess. So the US West vertical to horizontal story was trying to move from, trying to establish standardized technology and move all the way to a service-oriented architecture. And so in retrospect, I spent from 1992 to 1999, when I left US West, it was devoted to sort of realizing this strategy. So I ended up becoming the chief architect for a platform, a distributed computing platform that tried to support the horizontal transformation. Then we learned that the processes by which you develop service-oriented things where you're trying to promote reuse are quite a bit different than the processes for developing vertical application silos. So then I took a detour into something we called Enterprise Software Factory, where we tried to re-engineer the processes by which software was developed. And my last job at US West was to implement an application using the methodology on the platform. And so we had some successes, but by and large, it didn't succeed in getting there even after 7 or 8 years. In retrospect, I see that we were trying to leap too far into sort of the service-oriented space, the microservices space. And so that's why we never really succeeded in getting all that far, but that was sort of the intent there. After I left US West, I joined Sun Microsystems, first as the development manager for their online support center, later moved into an enterprise architecture role at Sun, and then ended up leading the solution design center for this project called IBIS. Now, IBIS was this classical application consolidation project. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But first, let me just talk about the evolution of enterprise architecture, but I'm going to introduce sort of the domains. What is enterprise architecture? And there's a variety of frameworks that allow different aspects of the enterprise to be understood, again, from an enterprise-wide perspective. And there's, more than 40 frameworks. This is just a way I've abstracted multiple frameworks But you'll see these domains common to many of these frameworks. I wanted to emphasize it's the relationship between the domains that's of fundamental importance. But you have these sort of standard domains of enterprise architecture. Security architecture is sometimes seen as a part of it. It certainly informs and is informed by it. And then strategy tends to be viewed as separate from enterprise architecture, but it drives the enterprise architecture. And then there's a variety of tools. So in the technology space, you can have your technology portfolio roadmaps, platform architectures that support what you're trying to do strategically. In the data and information architecture domain, you can have enterprise data models, ontologies, and you can think about your data management tiers. So the distinction between, for example, transactional databases and data warehouses, that would be something that's explicitly talked about in that domain. In the application space, you have your application portfolio roadmap. So which applications, we can do an assessment of their functional quality and their systemic quality. You know, are they based on technology that's breaking? Are they not, you know, they're going down all the time? How buggy are they? Those are sort of the systemic qualities. Functional qualities, how well they fit the business mission. So you could do assessments of those, and from those say, these are the applications we're going to retire, these are the ones we're going to invest in, and so you can build these application portfolio roadmaps. You can also build relationships between these domains. So for example, a very common one is this horrifically named, but actually quite useful CRUD matrix. So you can say, these are all our applications, and there's, in this view, 4 things you can do with data. You can create, read, update, and delete it. So you can establish a relationship between the applications in your application architecture to the elements, the tables, the entities in your data model, if you will. And you say, well, this application, what is its relationship to this data? Does it create, read, update, or delete, and so forth? And through that, you can look for the CUD applications, those that create, update, delete, and try and minimize those to get down to a single source of truth. And so there's a variety of ways you can use that, but pretty useful tool. The software architecture strategy I shared with you example that, you know, that vertical to horizontal is also an example of how you can evolve your application architecture in that domain. And then data flow diagrams are another common tool in that domain. With business architecture, which emerged a bit later, you can have business function models that say these are all the functions we do as a business, and then you could do function to data CRUD that says this function is the business function that creates this data, this function reads these data elements. You can do function to app maps, you can model your org structure as it really moved from basic function-oriented things to business process-oriented things. You started talking about value stream models, and those could be cross-organizational and business processes, and you could have mappings of value streams to the data that's, you know, what data is produced and consumed in which value stream. So those are just a sampling of the kinds of tools that enterprise architects would deal with. Enterprise architects also focus on architectural principles and various ilities. So they think in broad terms about availability and scalability and evolvability and usability. So that's kind of a quick overview of kind of what enterprise architecture is. I'm going to give you one more example before I talk about the transformation. This was actually my experience at Sun. So by 2007, we did an inventory, and guess what? They had 1,000 applications in their portfolio. And the IBIS project, the whole essence of this strategy, was to try and replace 400 to 600 of those applications with a single global instance of the Oracle e-business suite, take advantage of every module that it had. And that was the essence of that strategy. And so that was, you know, app consolidation strategy. It was a pure buy approach as opposed to build, commitment to vanilla Oracle. It was a 3-year journey. Did succeed in significant consolidation, and we leveraged every enterprise architecture domain, especially business architecture. This is an example of a data flow diagram from the IBIS project, actually just before the IBIS project, what led to it being launched. This is just how 35 of the 1,000 systems were interconnected. And I wanted to show this because this gives you sort of a visual of what application proliferation in sort of an unarchitected or business silos kind of regimen, this is what you end up with. You know, it's easy to talk about, well, I just need to interface my app with this other app. But when you scale that up, you end up with diagrams that look like this. And this is, again, this is just 35 interconnections between 35 of the 1,000 systems that Sun had. So we had many of these diagrams. Just to give you a sense of the scope of this project, there was about 1,000 people on the project team for IBIS. We had 50 servers that we were running the mid-tier on, and another four data tier servers. The transactional database size was about 6 terabytes. We impacted 285 of Sun's business processes, and 513 of the 1,000 applications were ultimately targeted for EOL. We got about mid D5 on this diagram when Oracle bought Sun and the IBIS program came to an end. So the thing I will say in conclusion about the evolution of enterprise architecture is it resulted in growing asymmetric power. So these technology providers in the industry, you know, we see shakeouts to where now, for example, Oracle dominates the relational database space and the large enterprise application space, along with SAP, sort of crowd out smaller players. In the cloud space, you know, Amazon, as I mentioned, is the 800-pound gorilla there. So it tends to reinforce the power of the large organizations. And in fact, if you look at the definition of enterprise, all of them started with and were intended, you know, from the perspective of and for the benefit of very large businesses with missions. Support the business's mission to help it grow its asymmetric power and help it achieve competitive advantage. So what could this have to do with Game D and the more beautiful world and so forth? So I'll try and transition there. And to do that, I'm going to start by referencing the work of Tom Graves, brilliant enterprise architect. I've been inspired a lot by his work. And he reimagined the definition of enterprise. What he said was the organization and enterprise are not the same. That in fact, an enterprise, sure, it includes your organization, but you need to think also about your suppliers and your customers, and not just your suppliers and customers, but your prospective suppliers and your prospective customers. So you need to think about really the whole market in which you find yourself. So that includes your competitors and regulators and others. And even that doesn't fully define your enterprise, because your enterprise includes community, governments, and non-clients and anti-clients and others. It includes investors and beneficiaries. So there's a very broad definition of enterprise. And so it's natural to say, wow, that's so diverse. How do you even draw that boundary around this enterprise? What do you even mean by this enterprise? And what Graves said was, whereas an organization is a structure and a means to an end, an enterprise is bound together by a shared purpose, or what he called a bold endeavor. And so it's bounded by vision, values, and commitments. So every organization you see in this entity has some relationship to a bold endeavor. And that's what defines that enterprise and distinguishes it maybe from other enterprises. So it was a brilliant shift in the definition of enterprise. It no longer was equated with just a single organization, a large organization. However, the practice of enterprise architecture remained tied to the perspective of and the benefit of an organization. That's where the money came from, to pay enterprise architects. So although the definition reorients us, the practice of enterprise architecture didn't change. But what if we reimagined enterprise architecture? What if we shifted our enterprise architecture gaze? Instead of thinking, about it, the definition of enterprise is fine, but instead of thinking about the architecture from the large organization, shift to the focus on the bold endeavor. And I think I've shared this quote from Michael Beckwith that I loved before. We need to shift from businesses with missions to missions with businesses, where the organizations subvert their goal to this bold endeavor. And so what might the enterprise architecture look like for an enterprise whose bold endeavor was co-creating a world that works for all life? A civilization that has some of the characteristics I'm showing on the right-hand side there. Does that sound like the kind of enterprise you'd like to engage in? I want to emphasize, I did a little shift here. This bold endeavor is only one example of a mission-centric enterprise. So enterprise architecture is the framework within which different enterprises could be expressed. But what I'm going to do here is flesh out this example because I find it particularly compelling, and I think it is more aligned with Game B, more aligned with the more beautiful world, more aligned with the third attractive. So I'm going to continue with some more inspiration from Tom Graves, because he said the enterprise is a memetic organism. The dominant organizational metaphor for the past century was organization as machine. But in Graves' view, an enterprise is a social construct bounded by human values and shared commitments, and hence the value of viewing the enterprise as a living entity in its own right. This is echoed in the work of Barbara Marx Hubbard, who said the structure that we need is not some new organization, it's an organism. And those of you familiar with Frederick Laloux's book, Reinventing Organizations, which I highly recommend, this is a quote from him. It says, life manages ecosystems of unfathomable beauty, and it does all of this with no need for central command and control to give orders or pull the levers. So armed with that, we can say, okay, so thinking about the enterprise, this bold endeavor, this collection of organizations as a bold endeavor, think about them not as an organization or as a machine, but think of them in terms of living systems as an organism. So what are some challenges? If that's our bold endeavor, what are some challenges we're going to need to address? Well, it's pretty clear, and I'll demonstrate why in a moment, the prevailing internet architecture is not really the answer. It's app-centric and provider-centric, so it tends to consolidate power, disempower individuals, and devalue life. It also, in the internet space, tends to feature a tight coupling of identity, data, user interface, and application functionality. It's very much like the business silos we saw. It's also, the thing to note is that living systems are not designed top-down. They self-organize bottom-up. But since our existential risks are global in scope, our enterprise must likewise be global. So how do we bridge that gap? We're starting bottom-up, but how do we get to global scope? And related to that is, how do we foster cooperation at global scale? And how can we do that while avoiding the two attractors that Schmachtenberger talks about, the dystopic outcomes that arise from the consolidation of power, or the catastrophic outcomes that arise from the extractive, exploitative, and unsustainable economic system that the current engine of commerce serves. And so, is that even possible? And so for this, I'm going to switch gears a bit and talk about this sort of why the current architecture isn't a fit and what an alternative might look like. And these are my three grandchildren. They are the ones that inspire me to continue this work. I've shared this part of the story in the last talk, so I'm going to go through it quicker here in the interest of time, but I'll just mention that our current application architecture in the internet, yeah, it's putting a lot more power available. There's more and more apps available, but the way those apps are delivered is disempowering. I talk about how I'm a complex human being. I have both a genetic signature and a memetic signature, the values I hold and the aspirations I have and my assumptions about the world, the knowledge I have. So that's me, a rich, complex, multi-dimension human being, just like you. And so it's natural to ask, so how well do their current systems support that? Well, if we look at the way the current predominant architecture in the internet is, you've got these silos where you establish your identity with each app. Each app stores data about me. The look and feel is determined by the app. That reduces me to this role of being a user. So I'm not unmentionable to me. I'm not a multi-dimensional complex human being. I'm a user of the application. Love this quote from Tufte. And furthermore, each app pushes its notifications to me. But of course, that's just one app. I use more than one. And of course, I'll just visually highlight this similarity, right? We just saw the 1992 diagram with US West. They had a vertical silo within their business. Well, I, as an individual now, I'm dealing with a vertical silo. But of course, I extend that to 8 apps. Now I've got my data, my identity, my user experience, and my notifications all fragmented. And trying to bring some coherence to those, all these different fragments of my online self. The burden for doing that lies with me. The providers are working against me and employing ever more sophisticated cognitive psychology and AI to keep me in their silo, to capture my attention. The data they capture, they control. It's outside my control. It's outside my visibility, who it may be shared with. But that's just 8 apps. Now, if you multiply that by tens or hundreds of apps, right? So this is the basis for the argument that the current architecture doesn't serve the kind of enterprise that we're envisioning. It doesn't serve our bold endeavor. So is there an alternative? Oh, yeah, this looks like that. So an alternative might be something that is more person-centric, where I determine what's urgent to me. So I have a notifications layer that intercepts notifications maybe coming from multiple sources and delivers them to me in the format I want, when I want them, and how I want them delivered. What if I could be empowered to shape my own human experience instead of relying on the different look and feel of every application I deal with? What if I had a coherent look and feel that worked across the range of applications? And what if instead of me proving my identity to an application that is hostaging my data, what if it was the other way around and apps needed to establish their identity with me? Instead of me going SSO to all these various apps, what if they had to authenticate themselves to me? What if I stored the app's data instead of the application, and therefore I had visibility and control over who sees it? And ultimately, what if I bring the apps to the data? And I'll briefly mention the project I was involved with in Oracle. One of them, after Oracle bought Sun, I ended up being the lead for their HIPAA compliance effort. You don't think about Oracle as a healthcare company, but their customers are. And so the Oracle support organization, when they're helping a customer with a problem, would ask the customer, "I'll send us your log file or send us your database dump." And so those log files or database dumps could contain personal health information. And therefore, customers would say, well, we only will do business with you, Oracle, if you can get certified as being HIPAA compliant. And their inability to do so was costing them about $20 million a month in lost revenue. So that was the business case for this HIPAA compliance effort. It took us about 3 years. It's a complex project, but the nut of it all is, and the reason I bring it up is what we learned was that these uploads from customers, customer service engineers would each have their own favorite set of diagnostic tools, their own apps. And so they would copy the customer data into their local environment so their app could operate on it. And so they were bringing the data to the apps. And the essence of the whole strategy that informed this 3-year effort was to invert that and bring the apps to the data. So bring apps to the data was sort of the central mantra. And so we see with this expanded membrane of personal empowerment, instead of just me being sort of the victim of everything, if we could do something like this, then we extremely expanded the personal empowerment. It inverts that whole power asymmetry that we talked about, with the application providers basically dominating users. So I'm in charge of me. All right, so maybe something like that addresses, from an architectural perspective, obviously there's much to talk about in terms of how you would do that, but maybe that starts to get at the answer to that. But we still have this problem of how do we bridge this gap and how do we foster collaboration at global scale. So I'm going to take these next three sort of as a unit. And to do that, I'm going to take a turn into this question of how can we foster cooperation at global scale. And I spent about a year doing a deep dive into something that I called evomimicry. It was inspired by biomimicry, whose central question is, how has nature solved this design problem? But when I was looking at our global existential risks and realized they were global in scope and systemic in nature, I thought, well, the only way we're going to succeed is if we could cooperate at global scale. But that looks impossible. On the other hand, maybe there are lessons we could learn from evolution, because evolution actually has done a stunning job of overcoming the very real barriers to cooperation. And so here's some sort of key findings from that deep dive. First, I have to dispel some myths about evolution. The one myth is that the central story of evolution is competition. It's all about red and tooth and claw, or whatever that is, and the survival of the fittest. When in reality, it's the dance between cooperation and competition has actually produced cooperation at ever greater scales and ever greater levels of complexity. And so as an example of that, each human cell is a cooperative of 100 trillion atoms. Somehow a human cell is coordinating the action of 100 trillion atoms. That's a pretty remarkable degree of cooperation, right? And a human body is a cooperative of on the order of 100 trillion cells. So faced with that, maybe cooperation at the level of 7 to 8 billion agents, like the human population globally, okay, maybe it's not unprecedented. Still leaves a lot of questions, but maybe it gives us some hope that there's some lessons learned in how evolution somehow overcame the barriers to cooperation. Maybe we have something to learn there. And so, long story short, the primary barrier, there are many, but the most insidious one is the free rider problem. And that occurs when individuals can participate with cooperators and get the benefits of cooperating, but they're not contributing anything. And so all of their resources are selfishly being used for themselves, and yet they're able to co-opt the benefits of the cooperators. And the problem with the free rider problem is the more cooperative you are, the more you're disadvantaged relative to free riders. And so it becomes this rather insidious dynamic, and it shows itself many examples of that throughout evolution. But I'm going to net it out to that problem. And so what is the ideal cooperative mechanism that can deal with those barriers? And it seems to have the feature of aligning interests and essentially having management mechanisms, and management in a general way. Could be decentralized or centralized, could be internal or external, but management mechanisms that ensure that cooperators capture the benefits of their cooperative actions, and those who harm others capture the effects of any harm that they cause. So let's kind of plant that as an ideal cooperative mechanism. So how is that operated in biological cooperation? How did we ratchet up to that level of cooperation that we saw? Yeah, Marc-Antoine, you raised your hand.
Yeah, just quickly, there's actually very interesting results on people like in prisoners' dilemma settings. Cooperators will spend resources at cost to punish defectors. There's references I'll send you about that.
Yeah, great. I'd be very interested in those. And that I would just note that's an example of the kind of management mechanism I talk about, right? That that where harming the group actually brings harm to the individual that's not cooperating. So it sounds like what you're talking about is examples of that. So in biology, about 4 billion years ago, we had this swirl of competing single-celled organisms called prokaryotes. They didn't have much in the way of internal structure, no nucleus, no real internal structure. And so there may be some cooperative behaviors there, but basically they were vulnerable to free riders. So mostly you just saw swirls of competing prokaryotes. But then about 1.9 billion years ago, this rather remarkable thing happened, the emergence of the eukaryotic cell. And so what that was about is that one of these prokaryotes actually engulfed another one, but instead of eating it, it actually started cooperating with it. And that became, that engulfed prokaryotic cell became what we now refer to as a mitochondrion, which is the power plant for a cell. So it became encapsulated as an organelle within the host cell's membrane. And so the enclosing cell and the enclosed cell became what's known as, I love this term, obligate symbionts. Their fates were inextricably tied together. It goes beyond just synergistic. They literally couldn't exist without one another. So that's a high degree of their fates being tied together. And through doing that, what that created the opportunity for was for organelles to perform specialized functions. So for example, mitochondria lost the capacity to replicate independently, and the rest of the organelles in the cell itself lost the capacity to generate chemical power. So it relied on the mitochondria for that. But then you got other specialized organelles emerge. And that process, called symbiogenesis, was initially proposed by Lynn Margulis in the late 60s, early 70s. She was ridiculed pretty heavily. Now it's widely accepted as this is, in fact, how eukaryotes emerged. We see this again about 580 million years ago, when from the swirl of competing eukaryotes, multicellular organisms emerged. And again, now the multicellular organism, important to note, there's this new enclosing membrane, and the cells inside the membrane became obligate symbionts. Their fates are tied together. So you'll notice that cooperation is increasing in scale and complexity. So the sizes I'm showing there from 1/10 to about 300 micrometers up to 5 to 1,000 micrometers for eukaryotes, and blue whales are 30 meters long. Aspen up to 8 kilometers big. So, and of course, the structure and the specialization, higher degrees of complexity. I'm going to overlay some terminology I introduced last time. This concept of a we space, I'm defining as a collection of agents in the medium or the protocols through which they can interact. And so that swirl of competing prokaryotes could be thought of as a we space. And what happened was a new I space emerged, a new agent, one level higher, with an enclosing membrane. So it became a new I. The eukaryote is a singular, right? And it has sub-agents within it, but it's in a new I space. And you see this repeated with the eukaryotes and we space and becoming an I space. So this notion of we space, competition, I space, cooperation is the repeating pattern I'm trying to highlight here. So we say, oh, great, that's good for biology. How does this relate to cooperation, human cooperation at global scale? So for this, we need to dispel the second myth, which is evolution is only about genes. In fact, evolutionary scientists have identified at least 4 streams of evolution. I'm going to focus specifically on cultural evolution. And it turns out that this same symbiogenetic pattern for ratcheting up cooperation has also been observed in cultural evolution. So it's not just biological. And for this, E.O. Wilson and David Wilson, and actually Eleanor Ostrom, did some pioneering work in this. And of course, this famous quote, selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups. Everything else's commentary speaks to what a central concept that is throughout evolution, both biologic and cultural. Here's another quote from a recent quote from a podcast David Sloan Wilson did. And it talks about how a group actually becomes a new organism. So the way I distill that out is that we compete in we space until we learn to cooperate in I space. So how can we scale up cooperation? Now we've got this swirl of competing people, and I'm one of them, hanging out in we space. And maybe through symbiogenesis, we can get to a pro-social organism, which is a new I space, and those compete, and we repeat that, and ultimately we get to a self-organizing, self-regulating planetary scale organism, an I space at planetary scale. But hang on, it turns out we already have a self-organizing, self-regulating planetary scale organism. And in fact, Lynn Margulis, the biologist who pioneered the theory of symbiogenesis, also was one of the co-collaborators on Gaia theory. So we already have that organism, but the agents in this enterprise include not just humans, but all living beings. And that's something our dominant culture has forgotten, that we're embedded in, and we are an integral part of an interconnected, interrelated, interdependent living organism. And in fact, our fates are tied together. We certainly can't live without Gaia. It's a little bit different question whether Gaia can live without us. And there's some interesting work that suggests that might also be true, but I won't get into that debate at the moment. What I will say is that we need to bring, for our bold endeavor that we've been talking about, what we need to do is bring human culture into coherent alignment with Gaia's enterprise architecture. So how do we bridge that gap? Well, for 5,000 years, the way we organized collective action was based on the subordination, the dominant subservience dynamic that Rand Eisler talks about. We coordinate collective action by top-down coercive control. And so you have multinational corporations with CEOs. You've got democracies that have become increasingly paralyzed and polarized. So you've got the emergence of authoritarian governments, maybe here in the United States, but certainly in China and Russia and others. And none of those seem like the kinds of structures that are going to get us to the enterprise that we're trying to, the bold endeavor that we're trying to achieve. So those don't work. But the good news is that alternative organizing principles exist. And so this comes from the work of Elinor Ostrom's collaboration with David Sloan Wilson. They generalized the principles that Ostrom had won the Nobel Prize in Economics for, to identify core principles that groups that seemed to succeed in cooperating as a group featured. And the first one is shared identity and purpose. And you can see that aligns well to our ideal cooperative mechanism, aligned interest. And there's another aspect of that, not just shared purpose, but the shared identity, that sense of we know we are a group, we know who's in the group, and we cooperate within that group. And then the next 4 or 5 principles really are all about those management mechanisms that ensure cooperators capture the benefits of their cooperative actions, and that those who harm others suffer the effects. So these groups have found ways to equitably distribute the contributions of individuals and how the benefits of cooperation are distributed, fair and inclusive decision-making. They monitor behavior, and when there's deviance from what serves the group, there's graduated response, both to helpful, reward the cooperators, and unhelpful, have consequences, negative consequences for the non-cooperators. Fair and fast conflict resolution. So those principles all speak to sort of that second management mechanism. The seventh principle, authority to self-govern, basically speaks to the group's ability to have sufficient autonomy to be able to implement principles 1 through 6. And that has to do with the larger we space that it operates in. And then number 8 says, well, we should try and cooperate with other pro-social groups. And so those principles, the good news about those were not theory, those were learnings from the study of successful cooperative groups. And in particular, Ostrom's work was heavily focused on successful common resource pool management. So if we think about that, then you can say, all right, well, an I space could have, as part of its memetic signature, the pro-social core design principles. But if you look at those principles, you realize actually there's a very large range of design options, still alignment with those principles. So like, yeah, each group needs to have a shared purpose, but what is going to be the purpose for our group? What binds our together? What is the purpose of our group? And what are our rules for membership? How do we determine this shared identity? Is it a membership committee that you have to get approved by? Is it self-nomination? What are the membership rules? How do we, what are the currencies? And I'm using Art Brock's translation of the term currency. What are the currencies for making contributions and benefits visible? How do we make decisions? So there's a rich space of decision-making that is not based on top-down command and control. Well, that is a way to make decisions that some groups may choose. But you have things like sociocracy and holocracy and crowdocracy, and even combinations of those, like the common good democracy, which combined a lot of those different things. Liquid democracy, you can see the list there. So lots of different ways, lots of space for different pro-social groups to decide how they're going to make decisions as a group. How are they going to monitor behavior? How is our group going to deliver consequences, and who gets to decide, and what's the criteria, and how are we going to deal with conflict resolution? So the point is there's lots of decisions to be made, and the answers to those decisions lead to different group architectures. And so from our enterprise architecture perspective, and I'm going to start to try and tie this back to enterprise architecture, you could say, well, our architecture for our bold endeavor should leave the widest possible range for answers to those questions, so that we can conduct evolutionary experiments to see which of the answers seem to thrive and which don't. It should help groups discover possible answers, so they're not just left on their own devices. They can learn from others and discover how others have answered those questions, and maybe even help them guide the decision process. So there's a variety of mesoscale, that between the individual and that sort of planetary level, intermediate scale organisms that are possible. And they can be distinguished, for example, by their different answers to the design questions of pro-social principles. But there's other meme plexes. So for example, you could have an I space that's unified by its allegiance or its devotion to, let's say, the memeplex of the CTA pledge. Those are the values that we all signed our support for when we took the pledge. Now notice that those two, I've showed two I spaces at the bottom. There's one agent that is a member of two I spaces. And so you can belong to multiple I spaces. You could also have an I space that subscribes to the regenerative economic principles of John Fullerton, which talks about an entirely different way of conceiving of our economic system. It's not exploitative, extractive, devaluing life. And so you also, just as we saw how eukaryotes could become multicellular organisms, you can start synthesizing these individual meme plexes and and demonstrate how they can work with one another and support one another. And so now we have this higher level memeplex. And so, and again, a memeplex, I'm borrowing the terminology from geneplex. Geneplex is a collection of genes that replicate better together than they do individually. And a memeplex is a collection of memes that replicate better together than they do individually. So that's same thing, but with memes. And so it turns out that maybe combining the pro-social core design principles with the CTA pledge and the regenerative economic principles, groups that are able to do that, to synthesize that, actually that replicates better as a group. They're in some sense mutually reinforcing. So that creates another just sort of area to explore in terms of these mesoscale organizations. And you could have iSpaces that then include that memeplex, that larger memeplex in their memetic signature. So far that I'm talking about the organizing principle of these organisms based on memes, but they can also be place-based. So they can differ, for example, so they can be organized bioregionally. And bioregions overlap, so you can have different iSpaces corresponding to different bioregions. So this begins to bring the streams of cultural and biological evolution together, and it begins to heal the separation of human culture from Earth's living systems if we organize in that way. And so there's this possibility of range of things to explore. And so I kind of had this inspiration a few years ago. We think about the tree of life in terms of genetic life in this sort of, diagram. And that's how genetic replicator-based evolution is characterized. But if we think of memetic organisms as living organisms, then might there be a comparable thing, sort of taxonomy, if you will, around memetic life? And I'm just going to show a notional thing. I actually think it would be a really rich research area to really create this for real. So this is just sort of fanciful. And I've just borrowed Latin names, but somewhere on this branch of memetic life, we invented private corporations and then private for-profit corporations. Later, we added nonprofits, but they were still private corporations. Lately, we've added public benefit corporations that are worried about not just profit, but also the planet and people. But all of those tend to be rooted in a concept of money, which is based on debt and positive interest rate. And those in terms are rooted in more fundamental memes of mind-matter dualism and the fact that we all live separate from each other and separate from nature, separate from the divine, in competition and so forth. So that's perhaps the most foundational meme that informs the whole range of memetic organisms that occupy that branch of the tree of memetic life. But what if we took as our fundamental meme oneness, the fundamental interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent nature of all life? Well, that's not actually a new thought. The vast majority of indigenous cultures never took that detour down separateness. But what if we elaborate more organisms? What if we imagine like what could be? And I use this term memetica incognita kind of in reference to the old maps when they didn't know what lay beyond a certain region. They call it terra incognita, the unknown. I'm trying to highlight that there's this whole space of potential memetic organisms that remains to be identified, that remains to be explored. And our enterprise should be able to enable these branches of memetic life to flourish. So based on things like free money or pro-social design principles, regenerative design principles, maybe a subset of organisms based on sociocracy and so forth. So big space to expose, to explore, and to help flourish. All right, so how does this all, let's bring this back to enterprise architecture. The story here is that we're not just imagining the next stage of EA for very large organizations. It's actually a fundamental reimagining of enterprise architecture from the bottom up. So if we look at the domains of enterprise architecture, we're moving from, at the strategy domain, businesses with missions bound by top-down coercive control, to missions with organisms, bonded by bold endeavor, values, and commitments. We're moving from provider-centric business models with function and value streams to agent-centric. Function and value stream models may still be useful. Those might be useful techniques and modeling technologies, but they need to be open-ended and not closed. And the fundamental modeling perspective is agent-centric, not single organization-centric. From an application perspective, we're moving from provider-centric, closed and proprietary applications. And there was this sort of evolution we saw from silos to monoliths to SOA to microservices, but all of them in the conventional EA, the organization and the application owned its data. But we're moving to an agent-centric architecture. Microservices based, I think the agility of microservices is a huge benefit. One of the ways that Amazon outcompetes, the reason they are the 800-pound gorilla, is whereas Oracle, for example, touts their ability to do quarterly releases of their application suite, Amazon releases on the order of 2,000 features a day. They do 2,000 releases a day. And the way they're able to do that is because they've embraced a microservices architecture. And so we should leverage that in our new enterprise architecture, but it should be in an open-ended services registry. Anybody can contribute to that. And it needs to be membrane enclosed. And that whole concept we talked about of bring the service to the data, bring the app to the data, don't bring the data to the app. In the application domain, move from application to subject-oriented. That's one of the shifts that we saw. One of the things I didn't talk about is that whole subject-oriented database strategy and the application consolidation that went with it. SQL emerged as sort of the primary interface to the data layer. But you end up with these giant schemas that are very highly integrated, and so they reduced a lot of the integration costs, but at the cost of agility. Like I just talked about, the once a quarter versus 2,000 features a day. And so one of the things that happened that I didn't talk about in sort of conventional evolution of enterprise architecture is we see an evolution from the data language interface being data languages like SQL to services that encapsulate data, which is essentially what a microservice is. So it's taking things apart and putting them back together in smaller units with the data actually encapsulated by a service interface. So the way you interact with it is via, DCE or SOAP or REST or GraphQL rather than SQL. But in the conventional EA, the data again is owned by the app provider. We're moving to polycentric, and I didn't get a chance to elaborate what that means, but essentially not all data is personal data, right? The personal data I should own, but some data is shared in a larger iSpace, and some things like memes are their own, they have their own center of gravity, if you will. So polycentric is about really storing the data in its center of gravity. I like the microservices architecture in the new world, where the service interface encapsulates the data rather than relying on database interfaces. But the data should be membrane enclosed and cryptographically secured. And in the technology domain, there's a whole lot we could say here, but basically moving from closed proprietary platforms that amplify competitive advantage to open-ended platforms for regenerative cooperative advantage that are cryptographically secure and decentralized. So those are just a very high-level bullets of what our new enterprise architecture could look like. So I hope this inspires thought and empowering feelings about an opportunity in front of us for the CTA. As makers, as technology builders, we can embrace the opportunity to consciously inform the shape of our evolutionary path. We can do that by embracing bold endeavors at global scale that inspire rather than coerce collective action, that bond us in cooperative I spaces without binding us, that put technology and service to life, not the other way around, in which everyone has a role to play. And I think there's an opportunity to adopt an open-ended, person-centric architectural framework in order to invert the power asymmetry, scaffold trust and ratchet cooperation to global scale, and foster interoperability, evolvability, scalability, usability, and I might add agility. So that together we can bring agency to imagination, both individually and collectively. That is individual agency and collective agency, and individual imagination as well as collective imagination. That's it from the technology standpoint. I was quickly going to just introduce the map. I'm sorry, that's it from an EA standpoint. I was quickly going to introduce the map just to give a hint of what the platform could be. It's an open-ended that could support that kind of opportunity I just talked about. Open source, open-ended, decentralized computing and services platform, whose goal is to foster the emergence of self-organizing evolutionary transformation at multiple levels, ultimately global. It's in early proof of concept stage prototyping. But I noticed we're about 3 minutes away from the bottom of the hour. And so, and I've just talked nonstop. So I'm actually think I'm just going to stop here and give me a chance to catch up to all the chat that I noticed was flying by. And just, yeah, just give people a chance to react and respond.
I'll jump in. Yeah, first of all, awesome. So much deep gratitude and appreciation for all the work that you're doing to articulate these things. And again, I feel like it's like at some level you're an effective voice for much of what lives within me. And so I just feel like that is so special, and I just really appreciate it. There've been a few calls, including my own in the chat, for like the deck, and then maybe kind of questions about, you know, whether we have agreements around how we share that with others. That would be one inquiry. I noticed that, you know, there's a little bit of like of ambiguity, I guess, about, when we look at like memetic signature. We talk about this is like from technical point of view, but then in a lot of these we're talking about values, and it's actually really interesting because if you look at the CTA as an example, it seems like there's a pretty high degree of alignment around values broadly, and then there seems to be a low degree of coherence around the mechanisms through which those values are to be expressed. And so, for example, you know, we have an initiative where the idea is, let's make a membrane. Let's make a membrane so that we have a coherent container for the CTA. Yes. And what is the memetic signature of that the container, the I space that is being thus formed? That actually doesn't seem clear because we have the values but not the mechanisms. And so then when it comes to like, oh, you're actually writing not just code, but you're writing, well, legal code, you're writing agreements, you're writing procedures, you're writing, you know, governments, bylaws, all of this kind of stuff, which I think is also fundamentally a part of the kind of memetic signature DNA. And so then it seems in a way like form the membrane, is a little bit of it's like yes and here and so I wonder if maybe you could speak a little bit your thoughts on what you think kind of the order of operations is there. You know, is it like, you know, you draw the edge and then you figure it out inside that edge, or is it that the edge is naturally emergent property of increased coherence? Yeah, anyway, yes, I'll stop there.
Yeah, on that front, I would say the CTA lacks a couple of things. One is I'm not sure what the bold endeavor is. Right? It's one thing to say we are values aligned, but is there a clear statement of purpose that's bonding us, right? That inspires us to aligned action. The other thing I would say is I think, and these are, okay, I need to introduce my favorite quote from my career. I've said it before, I'll say it again. The difference between theory and practice is smaller in theory than it is in practice. So what I'm sharing is theory, but my theory is that the pro-social design principles, because they were abstracted from successful groups, provide the framework by which that membrane could be established. And you in fact need to address all those principles. So it's not enough just to have shared values. You need, and the pledge, one could argue, provides a means of shared identity. I'm not sure we have a coherent shared purpose beyond just our general alignment values-wise. And the whole mechanism, those other principles for how we reward cooperators, how we get resources and distribute resources and so forth, we're feeling our way through. I think that the whole collaborathon process itself was an interesting way in dealing with how do we distribute resources in an equitable way. So I think it's edging towards it, but yeah, I think those other elements are maybe important. Yeah, Marc-Antoine and then Jiri.
The question of and thanks Dave for bringing that up. The question of membranes is fundamental. I think they often come from mechanisms more than goals, unfortunately. And Steve, you started with saying, you know, we have these mesoscale memetic organisms such as corporation, nation states, and unfortunately, they established their membrane by contrast. And I think, and by competition in a way. And I think a lot of any system delineates itself from the environment and starts with ensuring its own survival by ensuring its boundary. And the question is it still able to cooperate with other similar organisms? And you pointed that well into pro-social, that how it reacts to other similar organisms is very important, and how it interacts with and is somebody in our case, and that's very much unlike biology. We can belong to multiple memetic organisms. You pointed that out again. And that way, biology, like cells have lost autonomy. Cells in I don't want to become a cell in an organism. That's actually a fascist metaphor. I don't know if you know that. Everybody has an organ to the whole, and the whole has a greater purpose. And of course, that's not what you're talking about, and that's not what we're looking for. But it's important to have this distinction between the really united cooperation where components lose their autonomy and pro-social, where we belong to many organisms, the organisms cooperate, and there's cooperation at multiple levels, and it's intertwined. And that's also part of the evolution of cooperation you're talking about. You are saying that, but I'm just saying, here be the caveats. And I think whenever we're drawing a membrane, it's what we are, what are our goals, and what are the anti-goals. That's part of the membrane. It's part of what defines the membrane. Yeah. And again, you're doing that, but I think it's good to be explicit about some of the importance of that.
By the way, that is why in the memetic signature, I have both the inhibited and exhibited meanings.
Yeah, right? That's really interesting. Absolutely. Yeah. There's more I'd like to say, but I wanted to bring out the fact that, yes, we're following biology, but go.
Yeah, I won't take time now, but I don't totally buy the biology as fascist metaphor, because we don't, for example, have the heart deciding to ravage the resources of the lower body to support itself, right? So
I'm not saying biology is necessarily, well, I'm saying biology
Okay.
has been used by fascists.
okay, fair enough. Gary.
Yeah, I don't have time to express my appreciation of what you're doing. So, bracketing that, one thing did struck me. That's why I put my hands up. I think, to me, CTA, Collaborative Technology Alliance, is an absolutely clear vision. And even I've done the same thing. I've done my due diligence 1 month into, and I read around what's being published and what's being shared, and it is beautifully spelled out. So I think, well, I don't know, I can only speak for myself, but to me, in my perception, there's an absolutely clear, and Hilo itself is an instance of the kind of things that tries to move in that direction, knowing, and that's the crucial thing, which resonates really with what you said. It just, we need to collaborate, we need the technology, but it has to be an alliance. Okay? Yep. I think that is actually absolutely consonant with everything you said. And I really call on everybody to really look around. I wanted to write a write-up, but never had the time. But it's just amazing stuff, around. If you take the time, and it takes time, but and to put the other way around and to acknowledge what you're saying, that really needs to be expressed and signposted much better, because it's one thing to be said, okay, sign these alignment principles, but there isn't really. There are good places where it's all said, but it's not brought to you in a promotion. It's really come back to the finish now. The early stages, when I remember we had this discussion, we really need a medium post. We really, I mean, the CTA really needs something really. Something that communicates this, what I was just naming by, collaborative technology.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that in. And I just so love the CTA and the work that it's doing in the world. And I'm, every time I interact with people such as yourself and the others on this call, I'm just inspired by the vision and work and commitment to those that are part of it. And that's why I highlighted what I see as this really exciting opportunity for the CTA. To truly, realize that vision that you alluded to. I'd like to see it stated more explicitly, as you said, and become more visible. But yeah,
it's an opportunity for all of us.
Yes. Yeah. It's up to us to do it, right? I have about 5 more minutes, and then I need to drop. So let me just put that seed out there, and then invite anybody else to chime in who hasn't shared yet.
Okay, I'll just say very briefly, thanks very much. This is super stimulating. Would love to see the slides, please, so I can mull them over at more leisure. And I feel there's a bit of sort of divergence, and I think this is kind of like coming up with people, divergence between different streams of thinking. It's very easy when you start thinking about something yourself, to develop your own concepts, your own vocabulary, and so forth. It might not be different, but the vocabulary will probably be different. Like this we space idea, which comes up directly opposite in other fields. And so partly I'd like to do some ontological commenting, of course. What else? But partly I'd love to just explore around the practical steps that we can take, because I think the vision like yours is so sort of grand and so really interesting. And then how do we kind of keep that vision and also integrate it with other similar visions, but also explore it from the ground up, if you like, explore it from what can we do now practically, how can we actually collaborate, etc.
Yep. Thank you for that. Jeff?
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Wonderful. I haven't participated in this group, but I'm very keenly aware of what you have been doing for many months. And I'm working in directly with Stephen in a project that's totally directed to this. What I wanted to share is that I come from another meeting where I was working with the core teams who are organizing the seeds ecosystem. The seeds ecosystem that is whose mission is to create a space for evolving civilization from an extractive to a regenerative mode of being. And we were discussing precisely the need they have among all the communities, all the DAOs and all the platforms, to bring together a boundary that contextualizes the sense of purpose, or the sense of big mission or meta purpose, for everyone to find their particular role to play and contribute. So we shift, right, from this, all this shift that you have articulated in like the idea of having missions with organizations rather than organizations with mission. It's shifting from going to the external way of looking at it to looking from the holonic emergent we view. So I'm sharing this because I do see the opportunity of bringing this precise conversation, and there are other in the high-low collaborative collaboration that are proposing similar arrangements. So I would say that there's a great opportunity to bring together the leaders of these different initiatives, the pro-social initiatives, the seeds regenerative ecosystem, and the people who are working on solving the meta crisis by identifying the third attractor. And we're all looking for something in which we all agree, is that we want to, rather than create a world that works for all, we want to become a civilization where everybody can flourish. It's from within out, from inside out. And that in a holonic architecture is what I see that we can further understand how to integrate the need to evolving our mindset so we can truly be open. And the particular in your visuals, see, when you say that the we space becomes the I space, very specifically in our project, we were saying, well, we humans in many different initiatives trying to bring the world into come together, we humans need to become us humanity. And the us humanity perspective is where we find the I that transcends and includes all the we spaces. Mm-hmm. And then we can find the way to align the purposefulness of our humanity, because we will be able to see in a unified perception the wholeness of our oneness.
Yeah. And
this is a philosophical framework that I have that I'm working, and very excited to. So then, for what I think that it would be very cool to put a presentation of this, what I'm speaking about, to this group, and with the help of Steve, that maybe we can create invitations to do that. Because right now I need to go.
Very good, Jeff. I need to cut you off there if I could. Thank you for that.
Yeah, no, I need to go too.
And
I'll wait for your response.
Really quickly, Thomas, did you want to weigh in? 30 seconds.
Yeah, just the last bit of reflection. Thank you. It was amazing slides and talk, and I love the this concept of symbiogenesis to kind of as a way of viewing collective intelligence and evolution. And this I resonate with a lot of the stuff, and especially this concept of fluctuating between I and we spaces, which I see as a natural pattern of increasing complexity and order. So yeah, I really love that. I had one other thing to say. It's a little bit about how can we live in an AI friendly world, and using the agent person-centric architecture to let the AIs ask permission to us as individuals to use a little bit of data for a while, and then do analysis and then bring back something without like with respecting us,
Yeah,
I think.
cool.
I have to think more about that, but
Yeah, there's a lot I could have talked about. I didn't mention blockchain. I didn't mention Web3. I didn't mention AI. Those probably all seem like pretty huge omissions, but all I'll say about that for the moment, there's a lot I could say, but all I'll say about that is until we invert the model and put technology and service to life and invert the provider-centric to the person-centric, all of those technologies will be co-opted for harm. Thank you everybody for participating. I noticed some of the comments in there that I understand the desire for next steps. I will be sharing the recording and I'll find a way to share the slides. I also have at least 2 more talks planned. One to go in more deeply into this whole notion of bringing agency to imagination individually and collectively, and talk much more about the human experience of the map. Another thing that I haven't touched on much is the whole service interaction model. Marc-Antoine, at the outset, you asked about how are the rules written, right? How do these memetic signatures really work? And so that's tied up in the whole service agreements and offers and service interactions, and that's where pluggable protocols fit and so forth. So I will have a few more talks to flesh out different parts of this elephant that is the map and the enterprise person-centric enterprise architecture. But again, I want to thank you all for joining and your wonderful work you're all doing in the world.
Just don't do it exactly at this time again next time.
Oh, is this not a good time? Oh yeah, you have the
Yeah, it's always the meta